Tolerance was equally essential to Great Britain, the successors to the Dutch on the world stage. For most of the 16th and 17th centuries, what is now Great Britain was a pit of vicious religious and ethnic warfare. Protestants massacred Catholics, Catholics beheaded Protestants, Englishmen slaughtered Irish, Scots, and Welsh, all of whom retaliated in kind. There was no persecution of Jews because there were no Jews. They had been expelled in 1290. All this was to change after 1689. In that year, Parliament passed the Bill of Rights and the Act of Toleration. 20 years later, England united with Scotland and Wales, and despite continuing anti-Catholic bigotry and brutality, by the early 18th century, Great Britain had replaced the Dutch Republic in reputation as the most tolerant nation in Europe. Because of England's turn to tolerance after 1689, three groups in particular, Jews, Huguenots, and most importantly the Scots, were able to enter into British society with unprecedented freedom. And the benefits to Great Britain were immediate. England became the new haven for Europe's Jews, who, with astonishing rapidity, founded the London Stock Exchange, brought diamond and bullion trading to Britain, and almost single-handedly made London the world's new financial center. Meanwhile, instead of wasting resources fighting the Scots, the English accepted them as fellow Britons and put them in the service of the empire. Indeed, the Scots became Great Britain's chief empire builders. Scots were also, interestingly, the driving force in Britain's Industrial Revolution. The most critical inventions of the era, the Watt steam engine, the hot blast furnace, the integrated cotton mill, were all created by Scots, who were also Britain's leading thinkers and writers. David Hume and Adam Smith were both Scots. There's a reason that no one ever talks about the English Enlightenment, but they do, of course, talk about the Scottish Enlightenment. But if Great Britain followed the Dutch formula of tolerance back home, that is by turning itself into a magnet for Europe's enterprising, it basically pursued a Roman strategy abroad. Like the Romans, the British, of course, conquered and annexed and colonized, with India as the jewel of the empire. Also like the Romans, the British were masters at strategic tolerance. They harnessed local elites and local manpower, filling its imperial army with native soldiers. In the First World War, more than 1 million Indians served the empire abroad. But, and again like the Romans, British tolerance too had limits it could not cross. At home, the problem was Catholic Ireland. Abroad, the problem was racism. The British could never quite treat their non-white colonies the same way they treated their white dominions. And these limits on British tolerance, these failures to live up to its own Enlightenment ideals, would come back to haunt the empire, helping to tear it apart in the 20th century. Meanwhile, another power, itself a former British colony, was rising. And this brings me at last to the United States. Now again, for lack of time, of America's ascent to hyperpower status, I'm actually going to say almost nothing here. If my thesis is correct that the secret to world dominance lies in relative tolerance, that is the ability to attract the world's best and brightest talent, then the United States, as a nation of immigrants, founded on the principle of tolerance, has always had a leg up. To be sure, while the United States has always been relatively religiously tolerant, it demonstrated extreme racial and ethnic intolerance for much of its history, most notably towards Native Americans, African Americans, and other non-whites. It was only after the Second World War, with Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Revolution, that the United States began developing, however fitfully and imperfectly, into one of the most ethnically and racially open societies in world history. Not coincidentally, this was also the period in which the United States achieved world dominance. Now, in my book, I do try to make the case that America's growth and success, always, from the beginning, from its westward expansion to its industrial explosion, to its winning the race for the atomic bomb, to Silicon Valley and its domination of the computer age. I try to establish that all these things were direct products of immigrant contributions. But I won't try to make that case here this evening. Instead, what I want to do now with my remaining time is to return to the 21st century and talk about the implications of my thesis for the United States today. And I think I'll focus principally on the international dimension, and that is on America's place in the world. For all the dramatic transformations of the last 2,000 years, the United States today, amazingly, faces the same fundamental problem confronted by every hyperpower in history. But precisely because it is a modern democratic hyperpower, the United States is especially ill-equipped to deal with this problem. Let me explain. Every hyperpower in history has faced a difficulty that, for lack of a better term, I call in the book the problem of glue. That is, the problem of finding ways to generate goodwill, cooperation, and ideally loyalty among the foreign peoples that are conquered and dominated. History's first hyperpower never solved this problem. As the Achaemenid Persian Empire expanded, it came to include increasingly diverse peoples. This is always what happens when hyperpowers expand. The problem was the Persian Empire had no overarching political identity or glue to unite it. Only sheer military might held it together. So, under Persian rule, Greeks and Egyptians certainly didn't think of themselves as Persians. They hated the Persians. When a stronger, more charismatic military leader, Alexander of Macedon, swept through the region, elites throughout the empire simply switched their allegiances. They were not traitors because they had never been patriots. A similar fate befell the Mongols. With no common identity to bind together its European, Middle Eastern, and Asian conquered peoples, who frankly were disgusted by their barbarian overlords, the Mongol world quickly splintered into 4 large kingdoms before breaking up altogether. Of all of history's hyperpowers, only Rome really solved this problem of glue. Great Britain actually did pretty well, came pretty close, but only Rome really solved it brilliantly, which I think goes a long way towards explaining its spectacular longevity. Now, it's very popular these days to compare the United States to Rome. There are great books out there doing it, and it's a terrific comparison in many ways. But ancient Rome had one huge advantage over the United States, and that is that Rome could make the people it conquered and dominated part of the Roman Empire. Defeated peoples from Scotland to Spain to West Africa all became subjects of the greatest power on earth. Even more significantly, Rome turned large numbers of conquered men, both elites but also common soldiers, into Roman citizens, clothed with the high status and privileges that such citizenship entailed. By extending citizenship to Britons, Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans alike, Rome managed to Romanize vastly different peoples living continents apart, creating a common political identity, generating loyalty among its far-flung subjects. The United States can do no such thing. Because it's a democracy, the United States does not try or want to make foreign populations its subjects, and certainly not its citizens. So when the US government speaks of bringing democracy to the Middle East, it is not contemplating the people of Iraq and Afghanistan voting in the next US presidential elections. And this really has been America's fundamental dilemma as a modern hyperpower. And that is, America does not only dominate Americans. Even with all our own economic problems today, through our enormous economic leverage, our multinationals, and our military bases in over 60 countries, the US projects its power into every corner of the world, from Bolivia to Indonesia to Kuwait. But outside its borders, there is no political glue binding the United States to the billions of people who live under its shadow.